At which utilization rate percentage of VO2 max would you start focus more on aerobic power to raise the ceiling?
So let's say that this is Ironman specific.
Maybe you can explain the question more for those who don't understand.
It actually comes straight back to how can you integrate the VO2 Master in what kind of protocols, because I already said, so the utilization rate is basically a measure of VO2 max versus a certain point. And we normally normalize that as VO2 or oxygen uptake at your maximum lactate steady state or your VO2 steady state versus your VO2 max. So for example, in triathlon, we know that for short course that, for example, Tokyo, we can't of course say 100% on race day, but then a couple of months before when we were in the lab, you guys were sitting in around 83%, which is a fairly high utilization. But then of course, what we also have to remember, that utilization you can reach, you can reach 80, let's say 85% utilization, you can reach that with a low volume, and you can reach that with a large volume, because there is also one thing that you have to remember, that utilization rate is a one-dimensional parameter. It only says something about the ratio in one dimension, but not how long you can do it. And that's obviously where you can have one guy that's training 10 hours a week and one that has training 30 hours a week. The difference would normally be that you can have the same utilization rate, but it can happen just at a much higher power output or pace, for example, versus the other one, but you're still having 85%. But let's say that given inside, let's say for these guys, if it's Olympic racing and they are starting to come on much around, let's say around 85, 86%, that would be a point where I would start focusing a little bit more on pace or power, simply because they would lose too much top end speed if the utilization comes more over 85%. A little bit depending on the course as well. Tokyo allowed for more let's say higher utilization. Paris and how the racing is there now, especially on the run, it requires maybe a little bit lower utilization in order to have the, let's say, the top speed that is required. For Ironman, obviously you want to push it even further, and there we know, for example, that marathon runners, they don't have a high VO2 max, but they have an extremely high utilization rate, meaning that they can stay. So when you have a higher utilization rate, this also gives you the possibility of racing at a very high pace of your VO2 max, even though it's relatively low, but ultimately higher race pace than what you otherwise would be able to do with just a high VO2 max, but a low utilization rate. So for marathoners, there has been reported utilization rates around 94%, 93, 94% for the best ones, maybe even 95. But for Ironman, you will also want to be very high, but it's a little bit different because you also have swimming and biking that you also have to bridge in there.
It's a little bit more dynamic.
A little bit more dynamic, yeah. So that means that you can't go for an equally high utilization rate. You will end up with a little bit lower utilization rate to be in position for that. But the consequence in Ironman is obviously the VO2 max is going to be lower. So you end up also with a higher utilization rate, because you obviously need to be able to race fast with a limited amount of or sparingly use of glycogen at a fairly high pace. Yeah.